I did want to do a December wrap-up even though it's late. So I know I'm late. It's my channel, I'm gonna do it my way. Hi everyone, it's me, Jess. A little disheveled, Jess. What's going on? Oh, okay. So I know that I'm a little behind schedule in my uploads. This is a December wrap-up, almost at the end of January. I will get back on track at some point, or I might not. Either way, I figure content is content, and I did read these books and I did want to talk about them. So yes, it's the December wrap-up. If I had to say, majority of these books I did read in December. Some of them I finished in January. But just to be in keeping with the booktube norms, I suppose, I'll call it a December wrap-up. I'm going to talk about 6 books that I read. Some of them were quite a challenge. So several of them I didn't read them in time to review for the best books of 2022 because I have to film the videos, edit them, and then get them up for those of you who want to know a little bit about the behind the scenes. So I often am filming videos like quite a bit of time before I end up posting them. So I'm doing this as a hobby, you know, so it's not something that I want to put a ton of pressure on myself about. So there are 6 books that I'm going to talk about. I don't know if it was just as a result of having read a lot of really good books or just reading a lot at the same time. I really pushed myself near the end of the year to read quite a lot because I was trying to reach my goals and I was a little bit behind, and I had a bunch of new subscribers on my channel, which is wonderful. If you're new here, I'm so happy to have you here, and if you've been here for a while, well, you know how much I care about the people taking their time to watch my videos. Thank you so much for sticking with me, especially as I ramble sometimes. But anyway, hopefully you enjoy the content. Maybe say hi, leave a comment below if you're new to the channel or if you've never left a comment before. It's always interesting to interact with people who are watching. I don't want to go off on a tangent here because I do want to go over my wrap-up, and my wrap-ups can be kind of long because I always have a lot to say about the books that I read. But I was thinking about how I would like to kind of slow it down a little bit. After having filmed the goals video for 2023 and reflecting even more on this, I realized that I don't want to rush through books. I want to be able to enjoy them. I don't want to put them on audiobook and put it on triple speed or whatever needs to be done to get it read for the end of the month and in time to do some bookish content. So I am going to take my time, and that also means that maybe my wrap-up videos will be a little bit long so I can gather my thoughts and say everything I want to say about books that I've read. I hope that's in keeping with people who are watching. Again, I'm one of those people who's doing this more for my own pleasure than for anything else. So a couple of these books I read I'll start with the 2 books that I read for my book clubs. First one was The Book of Longings by Sue Monk Kidd. Now, this is not a book that I would have normally chosen to read on my own, just because the topic is something that I think I would probably steer away from. Sue Monk Kidd wrote The Secret Life of Bees, which I think was a really popular book. I haven't read it. Much loved. So I think just based on that, I was willing to participate in because it's part of my book club. The Book of Longings tells a story it's a fictional story, although I think that she did do a lot of research in the writing of the book. But the historical context of the book is at the time when Jesus was alive up until the time that he was executed. And the story is about Anna, his fictional wife. And I was at first not really interested because I'm not a very religious person. I didn't really want to read a religious book. And I figured that there was no way of really getting around the story of Jesus and the writing of the story of his wife Anna. But my friends in the book club all assured me, oh, this is not a religious book. It's not a religious book. It's a very feminist book. And so I went ahead and read it. Now, with that being said, and this book has very high ratings on Goodreads, but myself, it wasn't for me. It was very long. It was almost 400 pages long, and I didn't enjoy this book. I enjoyed parts of this book, but it wasn't, I would have preferred to have read something else. So it's one of those books that if I wasn't in a book club, I definitely would have DNF'd it, and I felt an obligation to read it. But the story is about a period of Jesus's life that we don't really know anything about, the period of time from like when he's 18 till he's 30. And so their author writes this fictionalized version of events. I had a really hard time suspending my disbelief. Focuses on, like I said, the character of Anna, who's a woman who ends up marrying Jesus, she comes from a wealthier family, and she's learned to read and write. And the idea is that it focuses on her being this very independent, free-thinking, free-spirited woman. And most of the book is about her, and just she's a writer and her love of writing in a time when women were meant to have children and meant to keep the house, and all of the activities involved in women's lives and women's work were very laborious, a lot more laborious than they are now. So Jesus nicknames this woman Anna Little Thunder, and she's supposed to have this very rebellious attitude, and she wants to give a voice to women, and she wants to write women's stories. There's very much this idea that women should matter, and that their ideas and their thoughts should matter outside of them being in the home and bearing children, basically. I mean, I think that the idea was interesting. Most of the women in my book club group liked this book, and it was well written, but it just was way too long. And I found parts of it very, very, very boring. Maybe it would have worked better if it had been a bit shorter. I think it could have been definitely 100 pages shorter. It could have been a novella. It could have been it's sort of an interesting idea, but it just wasn't told. Her story wasn't told in a way that I thought was very believable. Really didn't hold my interest. So I can't recommend it because I didn't like it, but if it sounds like it would be interesting to you, and if you've read Sue Monkid's other books and you like her, you probably would really enjoy this book. Like it was no problem with it. It just told this very kind of linear story that wasn't that interesting, in my opinion. The second book that I'm going to talk about is The Sleeping Car Porter by Suzette Mayr, which we read for my other book club group. And I can't say that I loved this book, but it's one of those books that I'm really glad I read it. It was hard to love. I think it was written in a way to make you feel uncomfortable. So I think that worked pretty well. It was very effective. This tells the story of R.T. Baxter. He is a sleeping car porter. It's set in Canada in 1929, and Baxter, our protagonist, is Black and he's homosexual. The story takes place on a run that he's working from Montreal to Vancouver on the train, and the train gets stuck somewhere outside of Banff because of a mudslide. So his work shift is longer than expected. Baxter is a great character. He's a fan of science fiction, and he's this aspiring dentist. So he's been working and saving his money to go to dental school, and he found like an instruction manual about dentistry that he pores over. And it's just clearly a passion of his that some of the characters he describes, the quality of their teeth and what he might do to their teeth if he was able to as a dentist. So the story itself has this really claustrophobic. She does a very good job of making you feel very claustrophobic. It's very stressful to be in Baxter's head on his work shift because you're experiencing what it's like to be in that it's a job of servitude. So you're basically a servant on the train, really responding to people's whims at any hour. You're not getting any sleep. You don't have very much food to eat. And the whole time Baxter is worrying about these demerit points that he could be given, which if he accumulates enough demerits, he could lose his job. So it's a very stressful occupation. And then piled on top of that, you have his experiences of racism and his experience of feeling completely oppressed and constrained not just because of his race, but also because, and his job, but also because of his sexualities. He also has these desires, and we do learn a bit about his earlier life. I won't get too far into that as we go through the story of this trip. He finds an erotic postcard that he keeps with him, and then there's this idea, like there's always this fear that that's going to get discovered and that he's going to get punished. But it's that rich fantasy life that also kind of seems to be keeping him going. That and science fiction novels, which he reads. It was really interesting to read about this time in Canada and this particular setting. I think it was definitely a worthwhile read. And the characters on the train are kind of easy to dislike. You have, and actually he doesn't give them, the characters don't have names, he gives them nicknames. There's like a clairvoyant woman, there's a young girl whose mother is completely ignoring her. There's a stowaway. There are a bunch of other train characters, and there are interactions with those train characters along with the other men who he works with as sleeping car porters and his boss on the train. So yeah, I don't want to give too much away. The ending is great. The ending was really hopeful, so I really appreciated that. And I think it's definitely worthwhile reading. This was the Giller Prize winner this year. But I will say that it was a bit of a tough read. It was just, I wanted to get away from it, which is probably how Baxter felt about, being stuck on this train. And he also hallucinates. He doesn't get enough sleep. Like it's quite tough, quite a tough job, quite a tough circumstance. Anyway, so that was the second book for book club that I read. Oh, I guess the other one I have to talk about is another book club book, which I didn't end up wrapping for November because I didn't. So this is O. William by Elizabeth Strout. This is the third book in the Lucy Barton series. And I kind of wanted to start from the beginning, but everyone in the book club decided that we were going to read this. So I read it along with everybody else. And you don't have to read them in order to be able to appreciate the book. This tells the story of Lucy, who is 64, in her 60s, and she is mourning the recent death of her second husband, a man named David Abramson, who was a cellist in an orchestra. And through this, she reconnects with her ex-husband, William, who she has 2 adult children with. And she kind of revisits the relationship with William. He also is going through a separation, so they kind of find themselves talking on the phone, revisiting their relationship more as a friendship. William is this kind of philandering guy who is the father of her 2 daughters. During this period, William finds out that his mother had a family that he didn't know about, and he has a sister that he didn't know about. So Lucy accompanies him back to his hometown to meet this sister that he didn't know about. And I won't tell you how all of that plays out, but that's basically, it's funny because Lucy clearly has like feelings of endearment towards William, but he also really exasperates her. So it's not like they're coming back together. They're both very, very lonely. And so that loneliness, I mean, it's kind of an interesting commentary about how loneliness can bring us back into relationships with people that maybe we don't necessarily, wouldn't be our first choice. But when you're experiencing so much loneliness, you're finding yourself back to your old habits, or you fall back into familiar relationships. And not to say that those relationships were all bad either. So there's a friendship there that obviously has some value to her. But I do think that this book really is about grief, and it's about loneliness. I earmarked a few passages that really hit me. I'll just read out one of them. I have felt grief for William as well. Grief, she's talking about the grief that she felt for her husband. Grief is such a solitary thing. This is the terror of it, I think. It is like sliding down the outside of a really long glass building while nobody sees you. So that idea of loss and the suffering or grief that is so invisible to most people, and that's difficult to even communicate to other people. That one really hit me. That quote really hit me. There's some good writing here, but at the same time, I also had a bit of like trouble just getting through this book. I felt irritated with Lucy, and I felt irritated with William, and I didn't understand why she was spending so much time with William. So I kind of had mixed feelings about this one. I think it demonstrates you can, there's the impossibility of knowing one another completely. Like, it's sort of crazy in the story how William didn't know that his mother had another family and that there was this other sister. And then, like I said, I don't want to go too far into it, but there was something about this book that was kind of heartwarming, but it was also exasperating. It was frustrating to read this one. So if you've read Oh William, maybe drop a comment below and let me know what you thought, if you had a different take on it than I did. Because I know people really, really loved it. Yes. So the other 3 books that I read, I really liked. I'm gonna start out with, I guess I'll start out with Hamnet. I did read Hamnet, finally read Hamnet. Gosh, this was great. I really enjoyed it. It obviously a lot of people enjoyed this book and it's had high praise. I'm not sure why it took me such a time to get to it, but so for those of you that aren't familiar with the story of Hamnet, well, it's written by Maggie O'Farrell. It was a Women's Prize winner, I think, for 2020. It's set in England in the late 1500s, and it tells the story of, well, it tells the story of Shakespeare's family. But in particular, the book opens with a child at home ill, pretty seriously ill with a pretty bad fever, and the children are twins, so it's the female twin, Judith. So his sister Judith is sick, and Hamnet is trying to get help because he's very worried about his sister. And that's how the book opens. I'm not going to tell you how we learn it, or how we discover it, but eventually this plague, and it was a really serious, that's called the Black Death, right, creeping across England, ends up taking hold in the family, and Judith actually recovers and Hamnet does not recover. I'm not really giving anything away because I think everybody knows that Hamlet was written, the idea is that his son died when he was 11 years old. And that's what this book tells the story of, that period when his son died, and also the period leading up to his marriage to their mother. And the book itself really is not about Shakespeare. Like, Shakespeare at a certain point goes off to London and is writing and producing his plays, and really the story is more about Agnes, his wife. And she, as a character, is, the reason why she's not there is because she's off taking care of the bees, and she's an herbalist, and she has like premonitions, and she can see things, and she senses things, and she's a bit clairvoyant. So she is a really interesting character that comes from Maggie O'Farrell's imagination, right? This idea of who was Shakespeare's wife and what was she like. What was hard about this story, and I guess maybe it's a little bit of a common theme, is that it was really a story about this mother's grief, at least in the second part of the story, and her sadness. And Maggie O'Farrell writes about her, everything's really written from Agnes's point of view. When her son dies, her experience of her son's death and her life after his death is just, it just permeates sadness and despair and grief, lots of grief. And her husband has a lot of grief too, which is the supposed inspiration for the play Hamlet. But she's just never able to get beyond her grief. And so in that way, it was a very brutal read. So be forewarned. It's very well written. It's very good, but it was hard. I cried a lot when I was reading Hamnet. It was really nice. It went back and forth between the present day where Hamnet was ill and dying and dies, back to an earlier time when Agnes and Shakespeare met for the first time in their relationship and the beginnings of their relationship. Very glad I got to that one. And then I read Daphne du Maurier's My Cousin Rachel. This one, I know I said that I didn't read all these books in time to put them on my list, but I had read this early in December, and I love Daphne du Maurier so much. And yes, it was on my best books of 2022. It was written in 1952, and I think it's her third highest rated book after Rebecca and Jamaica Inn. And I've read both Rebecca and Jamaica Inn. I think Jamaica Inn is probably my favorite, but it's a little bit hard to say. Oh, I've also read Frenchman's Creek, which I also really liked, which is totally different. So I've read 4 Daphne du Mauriers. I probably don't have very many good Daphne du Mauriers left to discover, which is a little bit sad. But this story is so good though. She's so good. She's such a good writer. She is so good at creating like tension and suspense and just psychological suspicion and doubt in the way that she writes these characters and the situations that they're in. This tells the story of a man named Philip Ashley who was raised by his cousin Ambrose. Philip is the heir to Ambrose's fortune. He owns a big piece of land and a big estate in Britain, except that Ambrose, in his later years, the years leading up to his death, well, we find out that he had moved to Italy. In particular, he went to Florence and he met this woman, Rachel, and he kind of fell under her spell and married her. That's the title of My Cousin Rachel, so that's the Rachel that's referred to. Ambrose dies, but before he dies, he sends these letters to Philip warning him, or not even warning him, just saying like, I don't know what to do. This woman is spending all my money and she can't be trusted, and all of this wild stuff about Rachel. So Philip is very suspicious and he goes over to Italy and he tries to find out more about what happened to his cousin Ambrose and how he died. Ambrose is buried in Italy and he's trying to understand why. So already we have these very deep, suspicious ideas planted about Rachel and how Ambrose died. But then Philip comes back to the UK and he goes to see, so Philip is 24 years old and he's not going to come into his full inheritance until he's 25. And so he goes to see the lawyer, the friend of the families, their family friend, Mr. Kendall. His name is Mr. Kendall, yes. Who's the lawyer who's his trustee, I guess, until he inherits the money and can make decisions about the estate and about the money himself. He goes to see him and he's very upset about this woman, Rachel. And anyway, I mean, I could give you the whole Sparks notes on the book, but I'm not going to do that. Just so that's the setup. Rachel turns up in England. She's penniless and she goes to stay with Philip. And Philip, who had been so suspicious of her at first, based on the letters that he'd gotten from Ambrose and other suspicious little things that happen, little notes that he finds, it absolutely disappears because Rachel manipulates him and charms him. I don't know. It's very gothic. It's very mysterious. It's like the psychological mind games, the vanity of this guy Philip, and the wealth, and then the guilt and the suspicion and the mysterious death of Ambrose. And I'm not going to tell you how it ends. It has this very open-ended conclusion, which some people maybe won't like, but I'm a little bit ambiguous about it at the moment. I'm still trying to decide whether I like the ending or not. It's so good. This was so good. I haven't watched the movie yet, but I thought I might, just to see if it was as good. But I'm sure it won't be as good as the book. If you have not read any Daphne du Maurier yet, please read her books. And you could start with My Cousin Rachel. It'd be a great place to start. I'd be curious, for those of you who've read it, what you thought. I loved it. I love her as a writer. She's one of my favorite writers. 5 stars for the star giving. For those of you who have been around my channel, I have trouble with the rating system. You can check out my video about it, where I think I've answered questions in a tag about how I rate books. And finally, The Master and Margarita. Well, The Master and Margarita. What can I say about The Master and Margarita? The Master and Margarita, set in Moscow in the 1930s. It's during Stalin's regime. I heard it took him 12 years to finish this book. Heard that he burned his manuscript. It reminds me so much of Kafka. I mean, eventually this book was published in 1967, which is a long time after the author died. This was difficult. This book is not easy. It's deceptive when people talk about this book being so fun and hilarious and so great, and it is those things, but it's also a very challenging read. This translation is excellent, by the way. This translation is by the same translators whose version of Anna Karenina I read. Their names are very good translators. Their names are Richard Pever and Larissa Volokonsky. I hope I'm saying their names correctly. This was a tough read for me. I had a difficult time with it. So I ended up listening to the audiobook, which was a different translation, which may have also made it a bit confusing. It's a satire. Okay, let's say it's a satire of the life of being an artist under a fascist, like oppressive regime in Stalin's Russia. It's also within it, there's a story. Is it one of those books that has a story within a story? The story within the story is the story that's written by the master in the title about, it's a retelling of the life but mostly the death or execution of Jesus. Yeah, wasn't expecting that for some reason. I didn't realize that that was part of the story, which is funny because it's also a theme. I don't know how these themes happen when I read books, but a theme back to the Book of Longings, that same kind of story and time period. I was reading about them at the same time. The story opens with two authors who are meeting up at Patriarch's Pond. I love the opening of this book. I thought it was really good. And they're talking about, so one of them is named Berlioz, and Ivan, I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name, who goes by Homeless. And they're talking about a poem that Ivan has written about Jesus. And Mikhail is saying that in the poem, Homeless makes Jesus seem too realistic. So already at the beginning, we have this whole setup of religion and the norms in this under Stalin is this sort of atheist idea. And I don't know enough about Russian history. A lot of people say, oh, you could appreciate this book a lot more if you were Russian. I'm sure that's entirely true. And I'm not sure, even with such a good translation, if everything translates all that well. That's the opening. And while they're sitting there on the bench talking about this, a stranger shows up. And the stranger, who goes by Volant, turns out to be the devil. And he interjects and says that he knows that Jesus was real because he met him, and he was alive at the time of his execution, and he met him, and that's the opening of this story. Now, we don't know right away that this stranger, this foreigner, is Satan, but we discover through the reading of the book that that's who he is. And he predicts Mikhail's death, which then transpires, and poor Ivan ends up in a mental institution. So these two authors who are the main characters at the opening of the book, one of them ends up in a mental institution and one of them ends up dead, which is a kind of an interesting commentary on authors. Like, there's a lot of commentary on being an artist within a fascist regime, and what writers mysteriously disappearing and being arrested. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff where people are punished for ambiguous or unclear reasons in the book. The stranger shows up and he has a whole entourage with him. He has this cat, this kind of crazy cat who drinks a lot of vodka and causes a lot of mayhem. A lot of the book has what I guess we talk about as magical realism. It's a very dark comedy. And when this character Volant and his entourage arrives in Moscow, they really wreak havoc. Puts on these magical shows, and there's a ball at one point. It's quite a lot. Chaos ensues, you could say. The actual main protagonists, Margarita, and the master, who she's married to, actually don't show up until the middle of the book. So we've gotten excerpts of this novel about Jesus in Nazareth, the time of his execution. That's actually turns out to be written, that's Nola. moaning while he sleeps. I was actually, you know, this novel that was written by the master, we go back and forth from excerpts from that novel and the story of Volant arriving in Moscow and causing all of this mayhem and chaos. The master, we don't know very much about him. When we meet Margarita, the master has disappeared and she is summoned by Volant to participate in Satan's ball. She turns into a witch and flies around naked. Like there's a lot of weird stuff in this book. But anyway, so she agrees to do this because she wants to find the master. So there's a lot of, it's a little bit difficult to navigate this book and a little bit hard to understand all of it. And it was a little bit difficult for me to understand quite what Bulgakov was trying to say, particularly like about religion and I don't know, just it was a little hard to draw out the themes for me. So I had a difficult time interpreting it. I just don't know what he was trying to say about religion or about atheism or even about the idea of the devil. I could probably use a course. I could probably take a course and learn quite a lot about this book. So while I enjoyed it, there are definitely scenes in this book that are hilarious. They're really funny and silly. I did struggle a little bit with just understanding what was going on. Like I felt confused sometimes when I was reading the book. So that's not a great feeling, but it's not a big surprise considering it's a translated work. It's the kind of book that you probably need to read again. If you've read The Master and Margarita and you have comments to make, please make them in the comment box below. I don't know if it was because I was trying to read it along with so many other books. Maybe if I had dedicated more time to this book, I would have maybe have had more of an understanding or more thoughts on it. But because and this goes back to my comments near the beginning of the video where I really think I need to slow down a little bit and spend just a little bit more time with these works so that I can get more out of my reading experience with them. Not all of them are going to be like My Cousin Rachel. That's The Master and Margarita. I'm very glad I read it. But I feel like I need to read it maybe 2 or 3 more times, maybe 4 or 5 more times to really understand what's going on. And there are people who say that there's really a limit to how much you can get out of the book if you're not reading it in Russian and if you don't. Because it really reflects life under this autocratic regime and what it was like to be an artist under this autocratic regime. So like censorship and your own censorship and just there's so much going on here. What a beautiful cover, I must say. Beautiful cover. So those are the books that I read for December and I know it's late, but I really wanted to wrap them up for you and I will see you in my next video. Thank you so much for watching and liking and subscribing and recommending to other people. If you think other people would like these videos, then for sure have them come and stop by, check out the channel. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye. I am a little bit of a tired bunny. I'm so tired. I don't know what it is about this time of year between the extreme cold weather and the return to work after the holidays. All of it is just making me very tired. For me, it was just really difficult because I had a really hard time. This book club has kind of funny dates. Like, it's our meeting dates are at the beginning of the month in the first weeks. And this book is about. Hold on. It's only gotten worse. It's only gotten worse with time, everyone.